Hello, I'm Jim Townsend, Director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School. To celebrate Black History Month, the Levin Center invited Wayne State University Governor Shirley Stancato to join us for a conversation about her distinguished and lengthy career in business, leading communities, leading a major racial justice organization, and also now serving as a governor of Wayne State University, guiding this university into the future. I first met Governor Stancato, 20 years ago when we were working together to try to enable Metro Detroit to become a more effective destination for visitors, a place that could attract more visitors, as well as a place that could host major events like the Super Bowl. So if I may call you Shirley, I just want to say a word about your history, and then we'll get into your background and your experience. Shirley was born and raised and educated right here in Detroit. She's a graduate of Castech High School and has a bachelor's and a master's degree from Wayne State University. She went into the banking industry and progressed to senior level positions at what is now known as Chase Bank. I guess it was National Bank of Detroit when you joined it originally. Yes. So she worked in senior level. She was a senior vice president there as well as the head of its foundation. She retired from her banking career and took over as president and CEO of New Detroit, which is a racial justice organization founded in the aftermath of the 1967 disturbance, or uprising, as many people call it here in Detroit. And she worked there as its first female president and longest serving president, retiring in 2018. And then Governor Whitmer called and asked Shirley if she would fill a vacancy in the Wayne State Board of Governors. She did, and then shortly afterwards in 2020 was elected statewide to be a member of the Board of Governors, where she is, as I said before, guiding our university into the future and making some big decisions to move us forward. So, Shirley, that is quite a career. And I think we would need probably more than the time we have to even talk about half of your career and your life. But what I really wanted to do was start off by talking about your early years, talking about the community you grew up in, the conditions that you confronted when you were growing up, and then kind of walk through your career and talk about race, talk about your experience, talk about the things you've done both as a business leader and then as a person in the civic space working for a nonprofit that was bringing people together, and now in this role at Wayne State.
Well, Jim, thanks for asking that first question, because often when I have the opportunity to talk, I tell people to do the long bio or resume, whatever you want to call it, and you listen to it. And at the end of that resume, all you know is what I do. You don't know who I am. And what I do, the who I am comes to the table. The who I am comes first. So thank you for asking the question. I was born and raised in Detroit. There's an organization called Born and Raised Detroit. I don't know if it still exists, but I was. My parents actually made the trek from the South, from Louisiana, to Detroit in order to make a better life for their kids. So my two older brothers were born in Louisiana. I was the first of their children born here. There's six kids, three boys, 3 girls. And while I am the third child, I'm the first girl. My sister calls me the first daughter, and I take that. I accept that. And so, and we were raised on the west side, and in Detroit, in southeast Michigan, it's you're either east sider or west sider. And I was a west sider, raised on the west side of Detroit, really on a street called Wabash, around the Edsel Ford Freeway, Edsel Ford and West Grand Boulevard. I think about that time really, really very affectionately. My parents, again, as I mentioned, came from the South and came here. My dad was a construction worker and became a skilled tradesperson as a cement finisher, so he did streets and highways and that kind of thing. And my mom was a homemaker, didn't work outside the home. We had a really, a great childhood. Since my parents were from Louisiana, and oftentimes people think I am, because that really is a big part of my identity. If you've ever seen the movie The Help, that was my mother. My mother worked in the kitchens of white people in Louisiana. and understood what that was. And she was an amazing cook, just amazing. And all my friends and folks would come around, and they would, in terms of getting food from my mom. So food is a big part of any culture, but a really big part of our culture. And I continue to say that Louisiana has the best food in the world. Some people may disagree with me.
A lot of people, I think, agree with you.
Really. And so my mom did that. She worked in the hospital. When she came here, she was a homemaker. And so we went to school, and the neighborhood now is called Goldberg neighborhood. Motown is there, really expanding there on the boulevard. Goldberg was my elementary school. It's not there anymore, but that's the neighborhood, and it's getting there. I was so excited when I heard about that. So I went to, public school my entire life, including university, and really got to see the importance of having a public education as a part of the foundation for this country, because what that means is about access, and that everybody has access to that. And I'm excited and happy also to sit on the board of a public university as opposed to a private university. We had a lot of fun as kids. We did the whole hide and seek thing. And,
what was the neighborhood like? What was sort of the racial makeup?
Okay, so when we first moved there, I mean, this is like, the street was Wabash. We had other places. When we first moved there, this is what I call my home. We were the third black family, really on the block. The rest of it was white. But
what year was that? Was that?
I don't remember.
Well, roughly just
in like the 60s.
In the 60s,
yeah, late 60s. And in less than 2 years, it had flipped. All white people were gone, and they left quickly. And it was, it was what it was. Everybody was working class. When people talk about the matriarchal society, my friends and everybody in the neighborhood, moms and dads, whatever. That was what was my normal, right?
Right.
And so again, when the neighborhood was mixed, some of the kids were allowed to play with us, some of the white kids, and others were not. But we made friends with kids. Kids are going to be kids, right?
And the school, what was the Goldberg
Elementary School.
And was that integrated?
Oh yeah, it was integrated. I always
for a while at least, and then
the movement, right?
Yeah,
and people moved. And I use the word move because language is so powerful, and you'll hear people say, white people fled, black people moved. So white people fled Detroit, and black people moved to the suburbs. So moved. I used that word, that language earlier. Worked in New Detroit for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I mean,
language
it was
is so important.
So important. Yeah. We would go to in the summertime when school was out. During the day, my mom would drive us a couple days a week to Belle Isle. And we'd have picnics. It was the same thing. But economically, because my dad was a construction worker and there were 6 kids, and he didn't work in the wintertime, it could be tough sometimes. But what I always say, Jim, is that we weren't poor. We just didn't have any money. Right? Being poor, really is a state of mind, and being broke, if you will, not having any money, is a temporary situation. So my parents would always say, here's what, let me show you where we are now, but here's where you can be, and here's where you will be if you get the education, right, and that. A lot of structure in our lives. We went to church. My dad, when my dad died 6 years ago, he was 96 years old, and he had been a deacon in the Baptist church for 75 years. So
That's
I grew up
incredible.
in church, yes, went to Sunday school, taught Sunday school, a lot of structure. So we had a lot of structure in our life, looking back on it now, because that's the way, my parents made it. And it was like that's what I knew, right? Had friends in school, but did a lot of walking. I think about now, we walked, to school when I was in school. Everybody's on the bus now or in a parent's car or something like that.
Right.
We walked to school. When I went to middle school, junior high school, they changed the junior high school that we should go to because it was McMichael, but then we had to go to Hutchins, which was much more in the north end, and so we would take a bus.
Farther away.
Yeah, further away. So we would take a bus, but just walk into friends' houses and walk to church, and even though we had a car, but we did a lot of walking back then. I thought about that. I was reflecting on that. It was really and when you walk, you have a different experience than when you
of your community. Yeah. Shirley, you talked about the racial situation in terms of sort of some kids being able to, white kids being permitted to play with you, and then the movement of white families very quickly once black families moved into the neighborhood. What other forms of discrimination if any, did you experience growing up in elementary, middle school, high school? What was it like for you?
Well, there were differences really. I always got good grades. The ones I'm going to drag back, I mean, I did. And I remember in high school once at Cass, I had a really good friend, Mina. She was white and African American, and we talked a lot, particularly in the English class. And we sat next to each other. The desks were close, and Mina would always get an A on her paper, and I would always get a B. And we would discuss, why is that happening? Because we thought the same things, we talked, et cetera.
Right.
And then we decided to write our papers and flip our names.
Wow.
My paper had her name on it in her paper. She got an A, and I got a B.
Yeah.
Right. Now, we didn't confront the teacher, but between us,
why didn't you confront the teacher?
We just didn't. That's what she did. I mean,
she was assigning the grades for one thing. So
exactly. But
you didn't feel empowered to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's very.
But we told everybody we knew what happened. And so, because that was important for us then, yeah. That was sort of sticks here and even in my heart that at that time, at that age, we made a decision to do something because we knew something was wrong.
So did you have, it sounds like you were pretty close to Mina, at least in that class.
Yeah.
Was your group of friends fairly integrated at that point, or were people sorting, the community was starting to really sort,
wasn't it?
Wasn't it?
In school,
yeah.
But when you went home, you went to separate neighborhoods, right?
Right.
Particularly at Cass Tech as a high school has always been a magnet school.
So it drew from all over the city.
All over, yeah. And maybe even, I don't even know if maybe even the suburbs. Now you can live in the suburbs to go to Cass Tech,
yeah.
but it's an application school. But in school we did, people did the cheer team and the pep club and different clubs and different curriculums at Cass, all these different curriculums, and it was mixed. And so with your counselors, you talked about college, et cetera. But outside those walls, there wasn't as much integration as there was inside the walls.
Mm-hmm. And what is your sense now of the difference between, say, Cass Tech is still a revered high school. It's still a magnet high school. It still
My
has
grandson just got accepted. I'm so
really.
Glad. Yeah, he is too. Yeah.
What do you think his experience? How would you compare? Do you think? Obviously he hasn't gone there yet, but you've obviously known many Cass graduates more recently. What do you think their experience is in comparison to what you experienced?
I'm not sure. I know that the racial makeup of Cass Tech is still a multiracial school, largely African American, though Latino, Asian American, some white. So from that perspective, I know it's mixed, but still predominantly African American. And I'm imagining his experience will be very different from mine in terms of the fact that he's going to be, our daughters are going to drive him to school, and he has access to much more than we had, just in terms of what the world is like now.
Right.
And I don't know that he really is going to think about it in those terms of, am I here, what's it like? Because he's accustomed to his world is much larger than my world was at that point in time in terms of, the things that he has access to, his experiences.
Right, your access to information.
Or in my neighborhood, yeah, the neighborhood information, you can tell you.
Your world as a Detroiter, did it extend to the suburbs very much as you were saying in high school? You were pretty much
Detroit.
In Detroit.
And that was okay. It was really okay for us because everything that we needed and everything we wanted was there.
Now,
right. And remember, people did not drive as much. It's the whole thing about, we took the bus. I take a bus to school, but you didn't drive to the fill in the blank. We would go to the drive-in, but drive in and stay in the car and not get out of the car. But transportation had a really, really big impact on the kind of experiences you had, social experiences that you had.
Let's talk about that period of time sort of outside of school and talk about the 60s and 70s. You were, immersed in the community, of course, and growing up and a tremendous amount of change. It was a really tumultuous time in Detroit. What was it like for you living in that period of time when there was so much strife, there was the uprising, there was the aftermath of that? What was that like for you?
In terms of where we lived, we could sort of see it and feel it in the angst in terms of in 1967. But my dad said, "You can't leave this porch." right? And nobody can bring anything into this house. And so we knew it was going on, and we could see the smoke, right? Just in terms of it happening.
Right.
And, but weren't allowed to, if you will, participate in it. It was really frightening. We lived on Wabash, and across the street from where we lived in our block was a bus terminal where the buses came in. Eventually the buses bought the houses where we lived and we moved, but anyway, on the other side of the street because they needed it. And the National Guard were there, and they were on the roof of the bus station, and we're like little kids, like, you know, not understanding what that was about. Why is the Army here? Because particularly around our block and the neighborhood surrounding us, maybe the 6 or 8 blocks, nothing was really happening, but that's where they were. So it was really frightening. And again, not understanding what happened. When we drove to church that Sunday, when we went to church, when we drove along Grand River and Linwood and West Side, we could see what had happened, but really didn't understand it, and didn't understand it for a long while. My best friend lived on Claremont, and that Claremont 12th is where it happened, and she lived on Claremont, and she talked about what, you know, just how frightened she was, and really, again, not knowing what happened, not understanding what happened, because the incident that started that was not like was not a public incident. It was at a after-hours place. They call it a Blind Pig.
Right.
And something went on there, and there was ruckus, and then the police went there. So it wasn't like, you know, Rodney King or, you know, that it wasn't that visible. And so lots of folks for a while were trying to figure out what happened, what really happened that started this.
Well, I mean, I think we're still trying to unpack it, aren't we?
Right.
That leads me to my next question, which is how people remember not just that one, obviously the uprising, but the overall period of the 60s and 70s and the huge changes that Detroit saw. Do you think people remember that differently depending on who they are?
Oh, absolutely. People use the language differently. You know, whenever I was at New Detroit, and I still do, white people say the riot. You know, oftentimes black people say the uprising or the rebellion, right? Right. And, you know, people who are politically correct say the civil disturbance. And I've used that oftentimes and I would say that when I talked about New Detroit, I would say it started in 1967 after the riot or the rebellion or the civil disturbance based upon your perspective. And that's what New Detroit's all about, is your perspective, understanding where that perspective came from, and then we come together to try to change that in order to change policies and systems that will erase this piece. So yeah, it is that perspective, and it's what, you know, they were told. People say it was a riot. There was a race riot in Detroit in 1943. People don't talk about that. 67 was not a race riot, right? 1943 was a race riot. In the 1800s, 1860-something, there was a race riot where whites came into Detroit. So we don't talk about that. And the history is this, particularly in Detroit, is this piece, it's the 1967. But we need to look at what, you know, it wasn't like an individual, exactly.
The uprising, disturbance,
whatever
you want to call it.
2 years and then it was this whole system of just the outrage is what happened after that in terms of folks and how much money they made based upon their skin color. So.
Did your family suffer sort of the aftermath? Not that it sounds like everybody was safe in the event itself, but did that harm or cause your family's experience to change as this, you know, as sort of the acceleration of the movement, if you will, and other things that happened, disinvestment and other things that started to happen? Did that affect your family?
Not in a big way, really. Again, because we weren't, like I said, a part of it, and certainly we knew what was happening in terms of people moving and, if you will, the complexion of our schools changing. Right. And oftentimes we always had the corner store. In my neighborhood, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were African Americans. They owned the corner store, you know, across the street. Those kinds of things change, but so much of that, Jim, is viewed in the rearview mirror. Right. You know, you're in it and it's happening, but you have to have time to sit down and look back on it and say, oh, okay, let me see. That happened. What came first and what came second? So reflecting is really important, and have done that. And clearly, that really did change the face of our community. But I often say that many of us made a decision to stay
Right.
And what would it be like had we not stayed and others who were younger that came and stayed to do the work.
So you stayed, not only went to college, graduate school, but then decided, and I'm sure you had some opportunities coming out of school to potentially go somewhere else. You chose Detroit and you chose banking. Why?
Well, I didn't really, let me tell you why I chose banking.
Banking chose you?
I actually got a scholarship to Wayne State, right? The Elliotorian Business Women's Club, African American Women's Club, chose a young woman, and and I got scholarship. It was a 4-year, fully paid scholarship. But I needed other money. I needed some money, so I went to. I heard the banks was hiring. I started working at the bank as a kid. Basically, it wasn't because I needed money. It wasn't that the banking industry came. And
so what was your first job?
I was a proof machine operator.
What does that mean? I don't think most people know what that is.
So you have checks. They don't do that. You don't need it anymore.
Right.
Checks come through the afternoon shift. And you have to put the checks in a machine, dollars and cents. It's like running an adding machine.
Right.
And the check then would imprint on the bottom of what that dollar amount was, and it would go off to the big computer in the sky. And so it was like the production area, the factory area of the bank.
So you learned
and
the
when you
beginnings
looked across
of
the
the
floor,
banking.
the factory area of the bank, that's where mostly girls, women, girls of color. And in other areas, even then, it was even though you realize it after a while, but pretty much that factory area, if you will, proof machines. It worked well because you can work afternoons, and I did a couple of days a week, not every day, and made some extra money so I could buy my books and do the other things
So it supported you as you were making your way through school.
Yes.
But then at a certain point, I would assume when you graduated, there was an opportunity that came along to join the management or a training program of some kind. Talk about that. How that
So
was.
you made that assumption. I'm glad you made that assumption. It didn't happen like that.
No, okay.
When I actually, as a proof machine operator on the afternoon shift, I worked in one area, then I moved to another area, and running the proof machine. And then I moved up there because they had what we call Saturday supervisors. So full-time staff supervisors didn't work on Saturday, but we would work like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. So I was a Saturday supervisor. I moved up the ranks then. And when I got out of school, I'm like, okay, I got this degree. I want to do something else in the bank. Went to human resources, called personnel back then. The personnel manager said to me, "Do you want to be a teller?"
Interesting.
I've been a proof machine operator, supervised responsibilities, had a degree, and said, "Do you want to be a teller?" I'm like, "Well, no, I don't think so." And then I had some supervisors and managers who thought a lot of me, and they went to personnel. We talked about it, and I got a job in the management training program, but the management training program in the operations area, right? Operations area was vast, not the branches, but in the operations area, I got a position there. And so it's really kind of funny because I was put in one area, and when my managers from the other area found out what my test scores were, you had to take a test then, they moved me to the area because my test scores were higher than the area I was in. There's so much. We start talking about systemic racism is based on test scores. Your test to go from one area to another. But I was at a management program in operations, and then after a while, I asked to go to the management training program in branches, and after that, spent out and moved up and started running branches and doing other things. But
so you were in branches, and then you eventually you were in commercial banking or in lending.
One of the things that kept me at the bank really was the opportunity to do that. So when people think
to move
of
around
bank,
and
to move
experience different
around
things
and be promoted and experience different things, it was as if you were going from one job to another. So now people talk about, well, young people, they move too much. They only have a job for X number of years. I thought about, well, I did it, but I did it within one organization.
Right.
So when I did a job and I'd done everything I thought I could do and was ready to move on, then I would go and I would tell a manager, you know, let me move to another area. If you hear of anything, you know, if anything's going to come up, I'm interested, let me know, and I'll interview for the job. So that's what I did.
You took it upon yourself then to take control of kind of opportunities, at least to raise your hand when you were ready, when you felt ready, and that served you well throughout your career. So it sounds like you had a lot of success and you moved up pretty quickly over your career.
It didn't seem quickly, but yeah.
But I want to ask you, what was harder, being a black woman or being a woman, or being black or being a woman?
You don't separate it. You don't separate.
You don't separate.
You don't separate. It is, I remember I was on the board of Leadership Detroit, and we used to do, and I would lead the diversity sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we did was we brought in consultants who came in, and one of the activities that they did was really, really meaningful. What they did was they put around the room labels. So they would put male, female, African American, religious, and what they would say, gay, whatever, that they would say is, okay, we want you to look around the room and we want you to identify your own identity, self-identity, but I want you to do 1, 2, 3. So third, because everybody has different identities, 3, 2, 1. And when you get in that group, wherever that group is, then we want you to look at the people who are in that group and have a conversation with them, right? And then you look at the people and what happens. So if you're in a female group, they're black, white, whatever, age, different ages, and you have that conversation. So I'll never forget that the number one identity that I chose on this particular day was female. Okay, you heard my story, right?
Yeah.
My story, my he, 2 boys.
Yeah.
Me, first.
Right.
And I told that story. That's really, you tell the story of sort of
being the
why.
first daughter.
Exactly, and your identity. So there's a group next to me, and they said, Shirley, because I always took part in the activity. Can I ask you a question? He said, do you have more problems as a woman than you do as an African American? I don't know what you're asking me. And is that why you chose that? I said, no, I chose this because of my life story, which I told you about.
Right.
Really, your identity, and it's my own personal identity, and you don't really have one. You have lots of them. And so you don't know. So in your question, I never stopped to say, well, is this happening to me because I'm a woman or because I'm black, or both? I didn't,
I mean, it's going to be different in different circumstances, right? I mean, and that teacher that discriminated against you didn't do it on the basis of your being, a woman or a girl at the time, right?
Exactly. And so, but you don't, every time you don't stop, it's like, I don't know if it's this or it's particularly in the world of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of say, this happened, and let me figure out what I can do about it. But I had lots of experiences like that, and so again, I don't every time stop. Did this happen because I was black, or did it happen because I was a woman?
Was there something about banking that that related back to your experience in the community?
Well, once I got into branch divisions, so at one point MBD had 100 branches, and I ran half of the branches in Southeast Michigan. I had a peer that ran the other half, right?
Wow.
And so part of our responsibility was, who is your customer? Your customer are the nonprofit organizations that are around you, the other businesses that are around you, right? The individual business owners, they're your customers. So when an organization, the Urban League, Alternatives for Girls, had a dinner or something, you went, but then they also would come and knock on your door and ask you to be on the board. And so we really, from a branch division perspective, were active in the community, and that's where it all started for me, really, when I was in branch division at the bank, getting to know organizations and getting to know people and developing relationships with them, serving on their boards, and then as customers, they would have put their relationship in terms of the deposits would be at our bank. If they needed loans, then the commercial lenders would do that. So that's exactly where all that started, really.
So you got a lot of satisfaction out of the way you were impacting the community, both in terms of your presence on these boards or your what you were doing, but also the lending and the other services the bank was providing.
And I grew a lot too. I mean, I always tell people it's not a one-way thing. It really is a two-way. Treat the people that you meet, and Charles Anderson is the head of the Detroit Urban League of Detroit and Southeast Michigan. I met him then. I was chair of the Urban League board. We're still very good friends, 25, whatever it is, years later. Alternatives for Girls, I was the second chair of that board. Amy Good still doing amazing work working with girls who are homeless. And so, I mean, I could go on. And so it really does something for me, and I think I can bring something because I tell people all the time that the reason some of those negative experiences in terms of homelessness and other things didn't happen to me, there are 2 reasons, and it's Alfred and Marie Coleman, my parents. And I got the lucky straws on them, and everybody didn't get that. And so I believe that I have a lot, and hopefully I have a lot to give, but then I also get back.
So I want to ask you about the banking industry, because there's another side to the banking industry and Detroit's history and the history of black people in Detroit particularly. We know the statistics nationally, and they're even worse here in Detroit, where the big wealth gap. There was a statistic that came out of the Brookings Institution. 15% the median family, black family, has 15% the wealth of the median white family. On average, a black individual is only 44% of black folks own their own home versus 72% of whites. That, of course, is a byproduct of a long history of a system of discrimination, and it isn't only the banking industry. But you had a front row seat to that situation, and of course, by the time you'd come along, a lot of the bad stuff had been in place for many years, and there were efforts to change it. And Senator Levin, of course, was working to try to make the government a help, not a hindrance to that. Mm-hmm. But just talk about how you experienced that and how you view the banking industry and sort of how things played out in Detroit and maybe where they're going.
So I was a mortgage loan manager for several years. And again, that's what kept me at the bank. I did a lot of things. And the whole idea of credit scoring, right? Mm-hmm. A credit score is a score that a financial institution gives you based upon a lot of things. And you'd be amazed at some of the things. Some of it, like, it's based not just your income, right, but also how often you've moved. There, you get lower points for that. And so credit scoring is one piece of that. And so let's say you get a credit score that the bank can loan you X amount of money. We're going to give you we're going to give you a loan for a mortgage, and then you either have already found your home or you go out and find your home. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot, and we did a lot of advocacy around it, was the whole idea of the appraisal community. Mm-hmm. Individuals go to school and they get credentials that say, I'm a home mortgage appraiser, right? Mm-hmm. And so appraisals will go into a home, and oftentimes, many times, they go into a home in a community of color, and they appraise that house. That same house, if that same house moves someplace else, they would appraise that house lower.
Sounds like your English paper a little bit.
Yeah, your home ownership is the biggest piece of a person's wealth. So when you look at wealth, owning a home is the biggest piece of that, right? And so there were appraisers that we would not use when we got to the point we understood it for homes in Detroit. The other thing we would tell people, because you cannot be at home you're not supposed to be home when they're appraising your house, right?
Right.
And so we would say, when you leave, take your pictures down. If you have pictures of your kids and stuff, you're a person of color, take those, put them away, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes artwork, we tell them to do that because you have a better chance of getting a higher appraisal. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be equal to, but a higher appraisal if you remove that, if they don't have an idea that you are African American. So the financial services industry, the whole credit scoring piece is a piece of it, but also the appraisal piece is a piece of it. And we were getting, particularly on historic communities, historic districts in Detroit, we would use appraisers from other areas. Sometimes we even go to places like Ypsilanti that has a large historic district and have them appraise the houses. And there were certain appraisers that we would say, don't use these appraisers for homes in Detroit, because we did homes everywhere, mortgages, right? But use this appraiser. So absolutely, the appraisal community, those are human beings, individuals, and they come to their work with biases. We all have biases, and those biases plays out in a way for them that's detrimental oftentimes to people of color.
And so the way you're seeing this there are still issues with appraisals and
of course. Steering, they steer you.
It still goes on.
And realtors,
right.
Okay, you got the person who's a real estate agent, they'll say, well, no, don't move here. You need to move here. And I was also a recruiter at the bank for a while, recruiting too. And recruiters would tell you, I went to get a home, and the recruiter told me, don't move here. The real estate person, told me not to move here in a particular neighborhood. Right. So there's steering by individuals who are realtors, right? And they say don't move. There are a lot of reasons for that because, they
that supercharges these injustices and
appraisals. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is a system, and the financial services industry is a part of that. But you have the other industries that are a part of this systemic racism.
So moving to a more systemic role that you played, New Detroit. So you retired from the banking industry.
You retired.
You left the banking industry. Oh, well, excuse me.
That's okay. No, I didn't.
So you left the banking industry and went and became president and CEO of New Detroit. Talk about that experience. Talk about the work that you did at New Detroit, and maybe some of the things that you really found satisfying, things that you feel like were really successful in the work you did there.
Well, when I moved to New Detroit, was making a decision to move. It was a real process. It was a long process. I was in senior management We talked about, I was on like the floor, the 5th floor, right? Had my own suite, et cetera, at the bank. And Tom Jeffs, who was the vice chair of the bank, was also the chair of the board of New Detroit. And Bill Beckham, who was at New Detroit, had made a decision to leave and go to the Skillman Foundation. And so they were doing a search. And Tom called me and asked me, he had moved away from the job that he was in charge of the whole branch division, so at one point I reported up to him. And that's how we got to know me. So he said, come go to lunch. We went to lunch, went over in Canada, and he was talking about, it was really funny. I think he was retiring then, right? And he'd bought a foreign car, which at the time when I was, you bought an American car when I was there, so we talked about the car. But we talked about it, he asked me about it, he says, how are things going? We had just merged with Bank One. We merged with Bank One, wasn't MBD, it was merged. I talked about things, talked about my work, and he said, Shirley, you've lost your passion. And I said, no, I don't know I haven't. And he said, yes, you have. You should come, there's an opening at New Detroit, you should come and interview for the job. And it was this way, that's why he took me to lunch to begin with, I didn't really realize it. And over the course of months, it took me months to make a decision about moving to New Detroit. At one point I said no, and then I said yes. And so, yeah.
And were you glad, or how?
Best professional decision I ever made.
Why?
Because it was not only stimulating for my mind, but also for my heart. And having the ability to have those two things, your heart do work that encourages your mind and your heart, you don't really get that often. And then the people that I met, New Detroit is a coalition. I had 80 board members, right?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a coalition.
That's a lot.
Business, and it's a leadership organization, so for-profit, not-for-profit,
right.
People of all races, black, white, Latino, Asian, Arab, I mean, that's what it was. And all these leaders, I say all these type A personalities, right, focused on improving racial equity and racial understanding in metropolitan Detroit. That's the mission of New Detroit. And it was just amazing work that we did around the systems and how do you change the systems. And education was one of the big pieces. Education and economic equity, those are the two big pillars of the work at New Detroit. And I was so fortunate and really blessed to have been able to lead that organization where we started conversations on race, where we would go, because you need to have conversations. We had standards for interaction. This is how you interact when you're going to have conversations on race. And we would go to, for the most part, John McCulta's home. And we would have board members. We started board members sitting around the table, oftentimes 10, 12 of us, structured. I would lead the conversations. And
was that hard to do?
Oh, it was hard. It was very difficult.
Yeah.
But, and one of the things that I would tell people is, if you are not uncomfortable, you are not doing the work. It is very difficult because people talk about race in their silos, right?
Right.
So black people talk about it to black people, white people talk about it, whatever. And oftentimes be difficult because people, if I don't want you to say I'm a racist, right? So I might say the wrong thing. So since I don't know what to say,
I'm going to say
I don't
nothing.
know how to have these conversations. And so what we did over the course of 7 or 8 years is teach people, if you will, how to have these conversations that you need to have, particularly as leaders of these organizations, in order to move our community forward. We have the leaders because the leaders are the ones who make the decisions, right? Those are the ones that make the decisions, and they develop relationships with others. And so the story I tell about New Detroit is that when I describe New Detroit, I say you have a John Ricolta and a Maureen Taylor, right? John was a board chair, but he was also CEO, chairman of Walbridge, billionaire, white, male, Mormon, Republican Mormon. Maureen, head of Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, African American, female. I mean, she worked, etc. And she was, for the most part, a socialist, right? But Maureen ran Michigan Welfare Rights, and John ran this multi-international construction company, and they became the best of friends. And Maureen was able to take John to the people that she worked with and have John understand that, and others, not just John, but I use the two of them as an example that, you talk about pulling by your bootstraps. Some people don't have bootstraps, and they don't have, it's not because they don't want the bootstraps, but here's the obstacles in their way. And then John was able to convince Maureen that, okay, Maureen was, well, somebody's got to pay for the water, Maureen, because of the structures. And so that's the work that was done.
It's complicated. These solutions are very complicated, and a lot of times people make them sound simple.
Exactly. And did that for years and years. And then other organizations started having these conversations and realizing that what's the risk? What's the risk if you don't have the conversation? People will say, well, the risk is if I have it and I say the wrong thing, that's one thing, but what if you don't have the conversation? So figure out. You need to know how people who work for you, whoever, how they're feeling, and you get this authenticity by having these conversations. And they were difficult and sometimes, but we did have rules, standards for interactions. A no-fault environment is not about blame, it's about the issue, not the individual.
Right.
And so we worked through that and did it for many, many years, and I think that's what I'm most proud of, to have people understand that, number one, you need to do it, and here's how you do it, and just continue to have these conversations, because that's the only way we're going to break down a lot of these systems and barriers and obstacles.
Well, before we end this, I definitely want to talk about New Detroit and its work in bringing people together from different perspectives, and the way the Levin Center tries to do something very similar in terms of bringing people from very different political perspectives together to try to do oversight and get to the bottom of thorny, challenging issues. Because I think there's a common theme there. But before we jump ahead to that, I do want to ask you, you're not running New Detroit anymore, I realize, but it seems to me that these conversations about race, that at least there are some people that are exploiting the way we talk about race in harmful ways, that they're giving permission to say things in ways that are extremely damaging to our civic fabric, to our racial understanding. How do you distinguish that? Because on the one hand, in the work New Detroit does, it's wanting people to speak openly about race, but on the other hand, we have people who are saying, "Oh, well, I'm not PC or I'm not something. I'm going to speak truth about race," and they end up pushing people farther apart.
Because truth to them is their own definition of what truth is, right?
Yeah.
That's what I think about. And the other thing is, it really does need to be structured, if you will, in the beginning. I mean, I could do it now. We could sit down and have a conversation with folks who've done it before. It needs to be structured. You need to agree. We're not going to blame people. I remember we did a dinner and it was televised. Devin Skillion's.
I remember that.
And it was on television. They played at the Mackinac Policy Conference. And then people were going back and forth, it's not my, it is your duty. You have to understand, it's not a blame. We're not going to blame what happened to your ancestors however many years ago. But let's look at the systems that did that. So you have these amazing conversations and you demonstrate to people how to talk about race. And here are the rules. You can't do this, you can't do that. There has to be some structure. We had questions. It wasn't just a free-for-all. And so the whole idea of being politically correct, whatever that means, and people are tending to say that's a bad thing. I want to be free. I'm speaking truth. Well, maybe that's your truth, but let's look at the data. You just talked about data and mortgages. Let's look at the data behind what's happening here, and we can really move forward. I just think it needs to be structured. And honesty is, you cannot have a conversation on race, anything that's going to be constructive, by walking out, on the street and saying, hey, come in here, let's talk about race. There has to be some relationship to begin with, right? So at New Detroit, it was this organization that we had. We want to move the organization forward, and I want to go back to my place of business where I'm leading and be able to make changes there. You need to have some relationships first. That's the way that's the way you're going to move it forward, not by just having random people sit down and do it. So
that's a perfect setup for my next, and we didn't rehearse this at all. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those terms, until fairly recently, were far less controversial than they seem to be now. What is your view of DEI efforts sort of in the broader world to try to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then I want to ask you about what you think is happening here at Wayne and how things are going here.
I mean, I think that a lot of people, a lot of organizations have embraced it because they know they need to. And so in terms of, in the spirit of full disclosure, if you look at, in the United States, what's happening to the population and the change in the population, much more people of color. Right? And so if I'm going to have an organization, if I'm going to have people to work for me, I need to be able to understand those people who don't look like me.
Right.
And so the efforts are, they want to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. And so, and also, I mean, I kind of think it's a comfortable term. Mm-hmm. Right. When I would do talks in New Detroit, sometimes I would say, you know, race is a 4-letter word. People who didn't want to use it, they want to talk about diversity. Is more comfortable if I say diversity. Mm-hmm. But you know, what do you mean? Are you talking about, again, me being left-handed?
Well, diversity can be a lot of things. Right?
I'm a left-handed person. That's a diversity issue, right? Because the world is made for right-handed folks.
Right.
And so, say what you mean. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the.
But you've got to have relationships in order for people to productively have those conversations. Is that right?
But I mean, if you're an organization and you're diversity, equity, inclusion in each of those pockets. So in diversity is male, because men include female, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Race, you know, sexual orientation, all of that. So what are you talking about? Are you going to, at some point, you're going to pull one out. You're going to say maybe it's race. Equity is an issue of removing obstacles and barriers. And inclusion is something that I don't really think most organizations have figured out. Mm-hmm. And so I'll tell you why. When, as an organization, either you're a nonprofit, for-profit, university, when you go out to hire a person, right? Mm-hmm. You go out looking for a person who's going to fit in, right? I tell the story. I used to also recruited for the bank, and we were down at Florida A&M, a historically black college and university. Sure. Had a huge school of business and industry, and a lot of organizations had internships with the school. And so the bank, I was at the bank, we were down there, we took our chair down there, and came back, and a couple of times we took a couple other folks. And so the young people would get a chance to ask questions. They had General Motors, I mean, all the major corporations. And so it was John and Bill, and they were both white, and they were talking about the bank. Mm-hmm. So a couple of the kids, one of the kids said, "Can I ask you a question?" And they said, yes. They said, "Do you guys have a uniform at your bank?" And they said, "Well, in uniform, no." "Why you ask that question?" They said, "Because you both have on blue suits, white shirts, yellow ties, and tassel loafers." They were like, "We do." And so I tell that story to say that we say we want to bring in, we want inclusion. Now, that's a while ago, right? Yeah. And we bring you in and we say, that's how you dress. This is what you do. Instead of saying, tell us what, we brought you in because there's something, you have something we think that would be added to the organization. Right. And so tell us how to bring that in. I don't think people have figured out how to do that because it's much more comfortable to wear the blue suit, white shirt, you know, whatever. And,
well, what does fit mean? You know, I mean, there's fitting in, and then there's fit for a position, and there's a lot of blurring of the lines between what allows somebody to fit in culturally, perhaps, or custom-wise, but also be fitted to, you know, and have the background and the skills to do the job that's being asked of them. And these things aren't. It's sort of like when you mentioned, you know, separating being black from being a woman. Mm-hmm. Right. That doesn't work for you. Exactly. You know, you view the world, you know, from these multiple identities that are fused. And
everybody does. Everybody has multiple really identities. So diversity is important. Equity include important. But let's figure out what it is and what it is in my organization, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so there's different things at different times. And the inclusion part is something I think we all really work to continue to work on. I mean, all of us. Me, I'm not.
Well, I mean, obviously you're sort of an ideal person. I mean, there's many different people who can bring their perspectives to this, but given the work you've done before coming to Wayne State as a governor, you seem particularly well positioned to be helping on that front. How do you see it so far? Obviously, you haven't been here that many years, but how do you see the work of DEI trying to make progress on that here at Wayne?
I think Wayne's done a good job. You know, one of the benefits of me being at New Detroit was Roy Wilson, the former president, was on New Detroit's board, right? And so when he first hired Marquita Chambly, the DEI person, he brought her, introduced her. So I knew what Wayne State was doing, and I really commended Wayne State on actually hiring a person to focus on that work and to look inward also, not just outward, but to look inward at what's happening within our organization and what can we do and to help and support the individuals who work here. And so I think it's amazing. I think that Wayne really is working on a lot of levels. I mean, the work that Wayne State does with students and helping students become successful here. At the graduation, at Wayne State's graduation in December, you go to graduations, President Espy, when she was at the podium, she said, I want all of the first generation college graduates to please stand. A third of that audience did. We were at the house. And Michael Basuyo, who's another governor, we were sitting on the board and we looked at each other, we were like, wow, that's why we do this. That's who Wayne State is, and the first generation, and looking at what that first generation looked like. There were lots of kids of color, very racially diverse audience, and so that's what Wayne State's looking at in terms of the hires that are coming in, and we realize that we need more, particularly African American deans, etc. That's a focus because students want to be able to see folks who look like them. Right. Working on that, working on a lot of different levels. Working on, if you're a first generation college student and you have a problem with your roommate, you may not know how to deal with that. My mom and dad didn't have roommates here, didn't go to college. Right. But now Wayne State has programs in place that help students work through issues like that. Not necessarily, this is not just for first generation college students, but students have access to that. A lot of work around work abroad, study abroad, and that wasn't accessible some time ago. So a lot of work inward with the students and then outward with the community. President has a community group of community folks that come together once or twice a month, and it happened under Roy. Roy started before Roy, community leadership. I was on it at one point in the community. Now President Espy has continued it, and it's the president's basically council. And she's able to ask, and Roy was able to ask, how am I doing, how's Wayne State doing, and they get feedback from the outside, so not just internally, but from the outside. And I really do think that Wayne's really doing a good job of that. And I'll tell you, if I didn't think so, I would not have run. I was appointed, and I would not have run. But really doing a really good job, and looking at all these kids who, a lot of them who look like me and think they're in that place, and listen to their parents at the graduation. I get really emotional saying, "That's my son." I love that. Or hearing other communities speak. It's really, really amazing.
You talk a lot about social mobility, generational mobility, and that Wayne State really is a leader in that.
Well, U.S. News and World Report just reported that Wayne State is the #1 university in the state for social mobility, and what that means is income and how the income is raised based upon where you start. So students who come to Wayne State, many of them, Pell Grant students, which means they don't have a lot of money, and then they're able to, if you have a college education, what your lifetime looks like in terms of your ability to earn dollars. And Wayne State's #1 in the state and very, very high in the country, and we're really proud of that. That fact, because that's who comes here. We're an urban university, right? And the students who come here work with them. And over the course of the years, we've gotten awards. In the last 5 years of our graduation rate has increased for communities of color more than any other in the United States. So really, really working on it.
So we've
got a lot of work to do, but not there, but a lot of progress.
I want to ask you about role models that you've had over the course of your life and your career, #1. And #2, when did you first realize that you were a role model?
Those questions are difficult for me because, especially the latter one, but the first part, I don't want to say it was any one person. I really learned something from everyone I know. I'll tell you, Barbara Jordan is somebody who I really looked up to. She's the first African American woman to be elected to Congress, as you know, from. And
that was right Texas. During your period, when you were coming of age. Right. That would have a real impact.
And she says, she has a saying, and she says, the world, she says, remember, the world is not a playground, it's a schoolroom, right? It's a classroom. And so if you look at the world, which is, I didn't know I was doing that before she said it, but I've learned so much from so many people. And I try to take pieces of what I learned from people, what not to do, but what to do also, and take it with me. And I really, not that I don't have like any one role model. If I can think of my Sunday school teacher, Mr. Gale, G-A-L-E was his last name, was an amazing teacher because he helped us to look at look at the Bible from a certain perspective, right? And know who's speaking, who they're speaking to, right? And what is the time, and that's that kind of thing. So the things, my speech teacher at church, where we would have, Easter speeches and stuff. So, and then a lot of teachers. Mr. Hawkins, my sixth grade teacher, who was the first teacher who told me, Shirley, he's an African American, you really can be something. He would come and visit my parents at the house, and I would check papers for him, and he made me feel that I was somebody and I could do anything. So. Lots of,
a teacher making house calls. That's pretty amazing.
It was really amazing.
Yeah.
And so there are all kinds of folks. Like I said, Barbara Jordan. Oh my God, this.
And how about you though? There was a point at which you must have realized that you were becoming a role model.
A lot of young people will tell me, they'll be interested. She's my mentor, and I'm thinking, I am. When did that happen, right? Mm-hmm. I try to when young people call or want to have lunch with me, I try to do it through the years. I didn't really have a lot of people to do that with when I was coming up. Not that, there were not a lot of women in positions, not a lot of people of color in higher positions.
Yeah.
I got it from other places, like in my neighborhood, like I talked about, and my church and that. And so I don't know if I ever really realized it. My dad was really big on humility too, and so to say, oh, you're a role model. But I'm certain that people are watching. You never know who's watching you, and that's one of the things that I learned at home also. So there's a certain way you carry yourself, as my dad would say. And he would always say, be careful how you treat people on the way up, because you don't know who you're going to meet on the way back down.
Yeah.
Right? Those things. And so I try to be kind to people, and because I want people to treat me a certain way, but I do it because that's who I am. And what I say is that I work really hard not to let anybody change who I am. So I'm going to be kind to you. That's just who I am. And if I can't be, then we really can't have a relationship. But lots of people, not just folks that I work with, a lot of people that I work with, and a lot of them it was like men and women. It wasn't like all women or all people of color, Lots of folks helped me, and I took a lot from being able to watch people and what they did and say, okay. And then I realized later on that there are lots of folks that are watching me too, so that really humbles me, and I really feel fortunate.
Well, time is running short, but I wanted to ask you about two more things fairly quickly. One is the growing Michigan Together Council. So here your friend John Ricolta and you come back together just in the last year, asked by the governor to convene this task force to look at Michigan's stagnant population. How did that go? What do you think about the findings and recommendations? Just talk about that experience.
First of all, was another one of those things where the governor called and John called, and I'm like, I don't know if I really want to do this. and her issue, it needs to be bipartisan, right? And one of the things that both John and I said independently is that, Republican and Democrat, we got to figure out who that is, who that would be. And for John, having been my board chair for 8 years, and knew him before that and sort of watched the kids grow up, if you will, we were friends too. And again, it's personal relationships that make the difference. And so we agreed to do that, and we got to select work groups because the governor had education, pre-K through 12, higher ed, jobs, talent, and people, and infrastructure. Those were the 4 work groups. Mm-hmm. And we had probably close to 100 people that we assigned, Democrats, Republicans, and I did assign some Republicans, and, to John, to these work groups to do the work. The governor said it must be data-driven and evidence-based. And so you got to base it on data. And they came together over the course of 6 months. It was hard. It was hard work. We sometimes were meeting every day, sometimes virtually, and we'd go to Lansing and come back. And you had these different folks, people have their own issues of what they wanted to try to, get done. And, we'd get calls, this is happening here. And again, it was very difficult. But in the end, we had recommendations from each group. And in the end, the vote was, there were 20 votes and only 1 no vote. 19 people, Republicans, Democrats, Black, White, Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula, East and West side of Michigan came together and made these recommendations. They're on the website. And so the things that we learned that were really startling for me and made me stop to say, why didn't we know this? So Marty Vittanti is head of an organization in Upper Peninsula called Invest UP. Invest in UP. And once the work groups finished their work, probably was in October, whatever, then they had to present to the council. Council members and work group members were separate, what their findings were. And Marty was the co-chair of the Jobs Talent People along with Portia Robertson. So his first part was, he says, this is what I want you to know. He says, this is very, very important to me, this work. And he says, and while I'm doing jobs telling people, let me tell you this. He said, in the last, I think he said 25 years, 30 years, we have lost 48% of the K through 12 kids in the Upper Peninsula. Wow. They're gone. In one area, we've lost 80% of the kids. This is really, really serious. Oh my goodness. We learned, Jim, we are 49th, the state of Michigan is 49th in growth.
Right.
We used to be, when someone asked the question of what are the top 10 cities in the United States with the highest income, Michigan usually had 5 of them. Mm-hmm. We have none in the top 10. We are 39th in income, individual income. Mm-hmm. The state, this is the state, right? 4th grade reading and math in the state, right? Some of the lowest. So we have so much work to do. And we've been doing this work for a long time. Why don't we have that data? So now that we have that data, we know the direction that we want to go into. Hillary Ado, who's the Chief Growth Officer, the first one in the state, first one in the country, and she's the Chief Growth Officer for the state. She did a lot of focus groups, Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula, weekends, whatever, and getting information to find out what happened. And the last piece that really, really hit us between the eyes is this statistic. In the last, I'm going to say 25, 30 years, maybe a little more than that, the age 19 and under population has grown 18%. The 19 to 34 population, 19 to 35 population has grown 22%. The 65 and over population in the state of Michigan has grown 98%. So we've got older people, a little bit, and a big gap. Mm-hmm. And what we have to do is, those of us that listen to what the younger people are saying, they want rapid transit. And you and I've been through this. When are we going to have it? We thought we were going to get it. We worked on this for a long time, and worked on this for a long time. And they're saying, I'm leaving. I'm not doing it. Young people don't want to drive cars. They don't want to drive cars. Right. It blows me away. I just want to go get on a bus. And at one point, one of the work group chairs said, she says, what young people want is they want to wake up in their 600 square foot apartment. Mm-hmm. They want to get on the elevator, press the button, and go down to their job if they don't stay at home. And then they want to walk 3 feet to happy hour. Right? We aren't producing that kind of housing in the state, so there's so many things that we do. But now we have the information. We have people that are working on it. If you look at the governor's budget, some of the things she's already done in terms of the now free, tuition for community college and a lot of other things. We got to look at the way we fund. The way we fund education. Why do we fund education with the bounty on the kid's head? Is X per pupil funding, and in Detroit is one thing, and in Hamtramck is something else, and other something else, and that's why on the radio in August you start hearing say, "Come to fill in the blank, come to
We're pitting districts against each other." Is that really the way to educate our kids?
Structurally, we got to change some structural stuff, and it's not going to be done overnight. And
let me ask you something specific though because we're talking in the midst of Black History Month. Mm-hmm. What did you learn about migration patterns for African Americans? You hear about African Americans leaving states like ours, and many going to the South. Is that true? Did you find anything in that regard?
Metropolitan Detroit, large African American population. That doesn't draw African Americans. African Americans want to be in a place, if there are other African Americans that are educated. Again, the educated young, they're leaving here, they're not here. So that's not what's drawing them. And the Great Lakes is beautiful, but they want to be around other educated.
Well, they realize there's opportunity in places that have high concentrations of educated people.
And we have to change we got to change to really a different kind of economy. It's not the manufacturing economy anymore, and the young people are leaving. We got to get the young.
And that's true across this racial spectrum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but of course, African American people say, what? They're not. No, they're leaving too, and so we have to make sure we do some things so that young people will want to come back, and also that they'll want to stay. And we need to really, we need to look at it and we need to start doing it now as opposed to waiting until later. No conversation at all. We had no conversation about taxes because, you're going to raise taxes. We didn't have time to do that because we were putting together all the data that helped us see, we have a lot of work to do to be, we're a great state, but we have a lot of work to do.
So that was my takeaway from the whole thing, watching it was, this was a great report and a lot of interesting conversations and a very cool coalition that brought together to issue this, but the work is just beginning, and really the legislature should be digging in and doing in-depth oversight, in-depth investigations into what steps it should take. And there's no, left or right, there's not, nobody can claim that they figured this out.
But I'll tell you, one of the things that the governor did is she created the position, Chief Growth Officer. Hillary was amazing.
So she's made it a priority.
That is her job. She's got staff. This job is created, and she's made it a priority, and she knows she's already done it in her budget and put the budget forward. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm glad I'm forward looking, and I think all of us are going to look forward. We have a lot of work to do. We can do it because it really is a great state.
Well, I think we should close now. Shirley, I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk with me, to talk in the midst of Black History Month, and talk about your experience and your career and your vision, which are really compelling to hear. Your work and your career really are very, I think, consistent with what Carl Levin really believed in terms of bringing people together across difference to work and build those relationships, without which we can't move forward, without which we won't have the understanding to really tackle race as an issue, to, as you say, someday overcome the pathology of race. Race, of course, is a beautiful thing. Our identities are things that we can be happy with.
Race isn't real. Race is a social construct.
Right.
It is not real. And so there's no biological basis for race.
Right.
And so when people say race, it's not real, really, and you take all this energy around this thing that's not real. It was created, from an economic perspective to separate us.
Right.
And it's unhealthy.
So what would you substitute for it? If race is not real, then what would you advise people to talk about, or how should they frame it if it isn't around race?
Well, race was created for people to do that, and they don't even understand
Right.
it. We have to educate people on, it's a social construct, really.
Right.
And we have to educate them on that. I mean, culture is deeper than race, whatever that is. But it's all about individual relationships. Jim, I'm sitting here in this chair now because you asked me, not because I'm on Wayne State's board, but the relationship.
That's
really.
right.
Because you asked me. We have to take the time to get to understand the me, and I talked about it earlier. You hear all those, that's my bio, but who am I? Right. I'm the child of migrants, and I am migrants who came from the South to the North to make a better life for their kids, really, and who really understands lots of things. So when we get to that first generation, we can talk about where do we connect. When we connect, then we can begin to do the work. Relationships first and issues second. So. And we have a lot in common. But again, I'm sitting here because you asked me, and that's how I live my life, and based upon relationships. So.
Well, I'm so glad you said yes, Shirley. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for being with me today.
I appreciate the opportunity to sit here. Thank you, Jim.